A new dawn has broken, has it not? And it is wonderful. We always said that if we had the courage to change, then we could do it, and we did it.
And that's the voice of Tony Blair on his election night win in 1997. Tony Blair was the Prime Minister of Great Britain for 10 years after that. He took a demoralised, easy-beat Labour Party, he modernised its platform, and he sought to create a momentum for change in Britain. And he was so successful at this, his landslide victory in 97 was so crushing that it alarmed even him, because he wondered what would happen if that feeling turned against him. Tony Blair changed so much about Britain. Scotland and Wales got their own parliaments, and thanks to his sheer doggedness, so did Northern Ireland, and peace was found at last amongst its warring tribes. Tony Blair was no less bold in world affairs, where he urged the US to join him to stop an unfolding human catastrophe in Kosovo, where people now name their children after him in gratitude. He was also a full participant in the war in Iraq with his friend US President George Bush. The results there weren't what he expected. Saddam was removed and eventually executed, but no weapons of mass destruction were found, and the occupation was poorly planned, and he's been asked to account for his decision to go to war ever since. Tony Blair's memoir is called simply A Journey, and I spoke to him late last week. Tony Blair, welcome to Conversations.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Leaders often look oddly cool and reserved on election night when they win office for the first time, and now reading your book, Tony Blair, I think I know why. They're awash with conflicted thoughts and feelings. Can you describe your feelings, how they were on that election night when you'd won by such a thumping majority in 1997?
The thing about the victory in 1997 is that it came after 18 years of Conservative government. And so I'd spent all my time in opposition. I'd never been a junior minister. And then suddenly I was Prime Minister with this enormous majority. And whereas there was great euphoria going on around me, actually my predominant feeling was one of fear, because I was aware of the awesome nature of the responsibility that had then descended onto my shoulders. And unless you've actually been in that situation, it's almost impossible to describe it adequately. And one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to make this a very sort of human account of what it's like to be Prime Minister, rather than, on such and such a day I met the following people and did the following things. And that human feeling was very predominant, really, on the 1st of May 1997.
John F. Kennedy was apparently alarmed by the passions he could arouse after he made his Ich bin ein Berliner speech, and he was sort of charged by it on the one hand, but alarmed by it because he wondered where it might take him. It might sort of pick him up and carry him where he wouldn't want to go. Did you feel the same way?
Absolutely. And actually, I think if you talk to Barack Obama, he would say exactly the same. I mean, when you come to power and you have this huge mood, it usually carries with it, I mean, it can direct you in all sorts of different ways, but it usually carries with it, and this is the real problem, huge expectations, which no matter how much you try and contain them, really then take on a life of their own. And, people end up, I mean, I remember someone saying to me in New York after Obama's election, saying, everything is now possible. And I sort of said to her, well, like what exactly? And she said, well, I don't know, everything. And, you have that sort of, you have that sense coming with you, if you go with this great mood. And then, of course, the reality of government hits you. And as another American politician said, we campaign in poetry, but we govern in prose.
You write in your book that you thought you'd win over people with patient reasonableness, but I'm quoting you here. You think you've come to a debating society, but suddenly find you're in a cage with a bare-knuckle fighter and a howling mob. Is it really like that upon taking office?
Well, it isn't Prime Minister's questions, both mine and yours, I think. I think also, particularly if you're on the progressive side of politics, as I say, again, I was with President Obama last week in the White House, and you kind of, when you're there and you look at some of the treatment he gets from the media now, and you think, my goodness, the guy's only been there 2 years and he's getting hammered from all quarters. But it's the way it is. And you learn it pretty quickly, actually. And this is why the book's described as or entitled a journey, you then have to undergo a journey of hardening up.
I think your book is most, for me anyway, was particularly interesting on Northern Ireland, and you said that my first major speech as Prime Minister would be on Northern Ireland and peace. Now, your predecessor, John Major, had made some tentative steps forward. Why did you think you might succeed at that particular moment in Irish and British history, if you like, to maybe come closer to peace?
Well, it's a good question, actually, and I've never been quite sure what the answer is, really. But I just kind of felt that as we approached the millennium and the 21st century, it seemed just so old-fashioned and absurd that we were still, locked in this bitter dispute with terrorism and killing and violence on what was based on a, historical set of circumstances where, in today's world, Ireland and Britain would be working in the European Union. I mean, Catholic, Protestant, should people really be fighting over this in this day and age? So I had a sort of sense that if we worked at it, we could drive the thing forward and make change. But it wasn't terribly rationally based at points, I have to say.
One of the insights I got from it was that it was prosperity in the South, like in the Republic of Ireland, that helped make that change. That helped in many ways to actually make the whole thing in the North look a little bit old hat.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think the fact that the South really changed. When I was growing up, people used to make jokes about the Irish and all the rest of it. But by the time you came to the late 1990s, the Irish economy was in pretty good fettle and moving forward sharply. And sometimes you need those external circumstances for a peace process to work. I mean, I will say the equivalent in the Israeli-Palestinian situation is that actually the Arab world today really wants this issue settled. So sometimes you get a benign set of circumstances that allow us to push forward to peace in ways where a few years before it just wasn't possible to do so. And the economy in the South definitely made a big difference to that.
A day like today, I mean, it's not a day for sort of sound bites, really. You can leave those at home, but I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder.
And that's an exhausted British Prime Minister Tony Blair in 1998 at Stormont Castle in Belfast. And he's announcing the success of the Good Friday Agreement that marked an end to violence and the beginning of power sharing in Northern Ireland. Tony Blair is my guest in conversation. It's an interesting thing to go into a peace process dealing with several groups of people who are amongst the absolute most stubborn people in the world who forget absolutely nothing. And you write in your book that in conflict resolution, small things can be big things. Tell me how, at one point, it came down to the issue of an obscure Scots-Irish dialect, the whole peace process. It almost fell over at one point.
Yes, it did, because the Irish were very keen on the Irish language. And then this Ulster dialect, which was was said to matter enormously to the Protestants, suddenly appeared. And I confess I'd never actually heard of this dialect. So we then had a debate about Ullans, which is I think it's based on a sort of Scottish Ulster dialect. And this then had to have equivalence to the Irish language. And there was a great confrontation in which the Irish Prime Minister asked the leader of the Unionists that if there was such a language, perhaps he cared to speak some of it. And it got a little tricky at that point.
Given that it was, you talked about it just a moment ago, but given that it was about pulling apart these ancient grievances, long-running grievances, and the whole cycle of how they embed themselves within the various parties involved, what lessons have you drawn from that long knockdown, drag-out process of bringing peace to Northern Ireland in your current role as a peace envoy to the Middle East?
Well, the differences are obvious. The similarities are less obvious, but actually many of the similar things apply. One thing is that you need to be determined, and you need to grip it. And if you're not solving it, you need to manage it, but you never let go of it. And one of the things that I think President Obama has